Welcome back to another episode of Debatable with your host, Nina. For today's episode, I wanted to kind of talk about persuasion. And I know that's just like talking about debate in general and debate as a whole, but I do think that it is quite underrated. And if you are watching this on release day, then you might have noticed that I have published this right before the high school nationals. And that's on purpose because based on the analytics of everything, people seem to be listening a lot more to debate content in general right before a major competition. And that makes sense. People are cramming, people are trying to learn what they can. And so think of this as like my contribution to the pool of information people are cramming. I have prepared myself a little lecture to share. I've also prepared here a few motions. If you are listening to this as a podcast, then don't worry, you're not missing too much. But it's still better to watch this on video because I do have some slides and some written cases that we can all look at. Anyway, so the reason I wanted to talk about persuasion and framing specifically is because I've noticed that the trend for debate tends to skew more towards logic. And logic is not a bad thing. I think a lot of the strongest arguments have very good logical cohesion, but I don't think that's enough. And I don't think we should be satisfied with just running a lot of logical arguments and spamming those ideas, especially if, for instance, in a BP format or the British parliamentary format, there's a lot of strategy that gets involved. My day job outside of coaching for debate is that I do political communications. So I do strategizing, and a lot of that revolves around framing. It revolves around knowing the right words to use, being very technical, and making sure that nothing I say is inflammatory. In the Philippines as well, if you don't know, our libel laws are quite strict because it doesn't matter if the information is true or not. If it is damaging to someone's reputation, then they can basically file against you. So those are the things I try to keep in mind as I do my job. And it has helped me improve in debate the same way that a lot of my skill sets are because I spent a lot of my time in debating. So these things are like interconnected, and I wanted to spend time on those things. So there are three things I want to highlight when it comes to persuasion and framing. Because again, persuasion is the core of debating, and it's not just about making logical ideas make sense. Because in the top rooms, the strongest teams will come up with very good logical arguments. So the way you get an edge over another team is by making sure that your content is more persuasive, more convincing, that a lot of people would want to root for you. And this is not just the judges, though obviously you're trying to persuade the judges to your side. This also means that you would like them to root for you the same way the audience will root for you, the same way other people will want to talk about your idea. You want to add to that general pool of knowledge. So, how do you do that? And I think the first thing that you really have to do when you are debating is understand what debate you are entering. And I have a lot of episodes that you can look into that discuss motion analysis. I'm pretty sure there are also episodes that discuss framing in more detail. But what I want to highlight here is not specifically what you are going to say during your speech. It's more of the mindset that you have to enter debate with. So, obviously, when you are given a topic, you need to know the facts that matter for that particular motion. So you need to know the definitions. You need to make sure it's airtight and that there is no room for misinterpretation. You also want to be as fair as possible. There are already a lot of content online that you can find on making clear definitions. You need to know current events and the relevant context. You also need to know the actors that are involved and their proximity to the situation. This is very important. I think for every debate that you encounter, or every issue or situation that you encounter, you need to be able to spot immediately who are the top two or three actors that will be the most affected by this policy or by this motion. So let's look at the motions of the episode. So the first one. Social media and communication platforms should actively cooperate with law enforcement in the crackdown of illegal activities on their platforms, even at the expense of undermining their encryption and privacy policies. So, obviously, we can identify here that social media platforms are involved, the users are going to be involved, and perhaps there are also going to be criminals that ultimately get involved because they're the target of this kind of motion. But if you think about it, the criminals are probably not going to be like the directly affected actor because the motion does not discuss how it affects them directly. It's more about the law enforcement as well as the relationship that they are going to have with the social media platform. So when I ran this, and I believe this was the quarterfinals of Sunway, whoops, yeah, it was the quarterfinals. I was on the opposition team. I got an 82. Wow, good for me. I tried to angle this or talk about how a lot of the police officers are probably not the most literate when it comes to technology. And I poked on a flaw that I perceived Proposition to have. Because Proposition, when they ran this case, it was a very good case, by the way, obviously. You win some, you lose some, right? They talked about how the the issues of crime that exist on social media platforms are so intense that they need to deprioritize privacy, basically, that there was a stronger urgency compared to the privacy. And I asked in a POI if they were willing to give back end access to the codes, etc. And then they said yes. Right. So that brings us back to the specific matter. So, luckily, I'm quite matter loaded when it comes to how coding works and how the back ends operate. So, I recognize that there are a lot of, for example, metadata that they'll have access to that they are not able to pinpoint exactly who they are targeting and they're looking for a needle in a haystack. I also point out here in the context that a lot of social media platforms already do their best to regulate the social medias that they own so that criminality does not exist on their platforms. So they do algorithm sweepings, they do AI stopgaps, they have moderators and regulators, they look for slop content and take it out, especially if they are harmful. They have very strict policies and reporting systems. So, again, this goes back to what I said. You need to know the facts, you need to know the relevant context and the involved actors. Eventually, I run an argument later on about how the focus on looking through the code doesn't really attack the big mafias because chances are they're not on Facebook. They're not going to be on Telegram. Uh, I mean, a lot of them are, that's true. But if they were really that big a deal, they chances are have coded their own stuff. So identifying the actors and how extreme those actors are and how they are likely to behave made it very easy for me to kind of prevent a lot of the characterizations and interpretations that come from the other side. So that's the first thing, right? Like you need to know things. Sadly, that's just something you cannot avoid. You need to know things if you want to be able to debate well. Another is you need to know where the debate is now. So, going back to that first motion, right? We cannot talk anymore about simple privacy issues. I think that while those are important, there are very intricate discussions here about encryption and privacy policies. I don't think this is anymore about how much can the police look through your things, because even in my speech I admit that we already have warrants, we already have ways of looking through IP addresses, we already have ways to stop your account or temporarily halt it if we think that you have some illegal activity. So I've already made the concession that, of course, there are certain rights that will be put to the back seat in the name of criminal investigations. The debate is not about the purity of privacy. It's already about the extent that we allow police officers to undermine that privacy. So I concede that we can stop people's IP addresses or block those things. We can probably have investigations that try to infiltrate the mafia group chats in Telegram should it come to that point. But I think we have to draw the line on giving them untethered access to the codes and the privacy policies and um, whatever else exists on those platforms that make them work the way that they do. So I recognize that there are things that are not contentious anymore. And the things that are not contentious is that the police should be able to do what they need to do. We already assume that some level of privacy will be stepped on in the name of protecting people. We also assume that the right to free speech and expression is not absolute. Because, like I said, we're still okay with censoring, we're still okay with banning people, we're still okay with some level of moderation. So, what I try to run here now is the debate is about the extents that we give them, as well as how much we can trust the police officers to do their job correctly. Like I said later on in my argument, I even connected to how a lot of this can be abused, especially in conservative countries, especially in countries where there's a cracking down on political activity. Giving the law enforcement access to this could lead to the stifling of dissent or discussion ultimately. And of course, that's like a later on thing. But all of that I was able to derive because I skipped all the assumed debate, right? There are basic debates about privacy. There are basic debates about criminal justice. Every time you look at a motion, you have to ask yourself, what is this motion trying to do that is new? And there are going to be motions you encounter that are quite classic, of course, but I always try to, I guess, I try to challenge myself to find a new debate or a new angle. So, what are the current versions of the discussion that we ought to have? And I think, especially with social media debates, there's now this discussion of how much control they have over our lives. There's now a discussion of how we can't go offline, right? We literally exist online. You are consuming my content online. I learn about your activity through my analytics online. We're all online. So there is now a new element here of just surveillance. There's a new element of control that we need to keep in mind when we are discussing this. And if you are on proposition, you also need to be very clear of why the higher the stakes are, the higher we need to be, or the higher the the protocols need to be. I'm losing. It is the middle of the night. I am not the best at words right now. But basically, that's a big chunk of the discussion that you need to have. The point here is that you need to just know where the debate is currently, where you would like to have it, and more importantly, you need to know the debates that have already happened so that you don't do them again. And after all of that, that leads you to step three, identifying how much of this needs to be said. So, for example, I don't think I need to spend any time in proposition or opposition talking about how Facebook has messed up multiple times. I think opposition will agree that that's the case, but that's old news. And the debate now is, can we does it mean we can trust police officers better? Proposition can obviously use it to talk about how Facebook is failing their mandate of keeping people safe. But that's not the debate, right? That's part of the debate, that's part of the context. But the broader discussion is, are they doing anything about it? And are those things enough? But the second question is, even if they're not doing enough, does it mean the police can step in or law enforcement can step in? So that's why it's very important when you are framing a debate to not just know what you want the debate to be, but to also know what it shouldn't be and how to let go of discussions that have already taken place. For this part one, we'll go back to my case build here. I do spend a lot of time in the clarifications and context talking about what the media platforms already cracked down on, right? So I didn't want to have a debate anymore about what social media should do and why what they're doing is not enough. So I immediately addressed that by talking about how Platforms have a profit driven incentive to make sure that their platforms have mass appeal. They don't want criminals around their platforms because that is also bad business for them, especially if they are a popular social media site. So, inaction is unstrategic. It is proven by the weakening of X as a platform, as well as the backlash received by those more loose websites like Twitch. So, I think I had an example here where they had snuff rooms on Twitch. Actually, my teammates told me about that, and it was very sad. But all of this was basically to show that the worst harms that they are trying to regulate are already being regulated. So the discussion is not about those types of crimes. Chances are they're about the more underground crimes, the crimes that probably are more deep web kind of things. And then once I've identified that, I make the discussion different, right? Are these protocols the correct strategy, or is this motion the correct way to deal with that particular problem? And I even talk about what active cooperation with law enforcement would look like under their world, where they are likely to act on mere speculation. They would have to do mass sweepings of websites just to find out something might be going on, but they're not sure yet. And they will have to admit to giving IP addresses, location, timestamps of Wi Fi, back end access, etc. So, like I said, I wanted to make do with the basic debate about crime and talk about implementation. And you can do that. You have the choice if you want to deepen the debate to that extent. You don't have to, but like I said, it would be good to challenge yourself with every motion to kind of try to find a new angle or a more specific angle to focus on, because a lot of the motions that you see are worded in a particular way because the ad core wants you to debate something specific. Okay, now going to another thing. So the second part here. After you understood the debate and you figured out how to nuance it to the debate that you want, once you have figured out what the debate is not, how to elevate discussions, because all debate topics just kind of go to like a few core principles. Like that motion was really just crime versus people's rights, but in a more sophisticated and technical way. So the second part is strategizing how you are to approach it. And the first thing under this is identifying your priorities as a team. And this means that you need to know what the most important value of your side is, and you also need to prove why it's mutually exclusive to your side. So you cannot argue, for example, a vague principle of protection, because that is something everyone will try to do in the debate. No one will argue against protection. No one will say that people deserve less rights. It's going to be more specific on how exactly these rights are being acted on. How exactly are these rights being maintained? So now we're gonna go to the second motion here. This House regrets the rise of citizen journalism. And I don't know where that case bill is. Nope, that's a different motion. Here, this House regrets the rise of citizen journalism. Like I said, you need to identify your nuanced principle here. And for me, I think that I highlighted here in my case how there are no editorial restraints, right? That's the first thing I highlight. The thing that they will argue is the most beneficial thing about citizen journalism is the real-time nature of it, or the fact that it represents a more diverse of views. And admittedly, right, a lot of traditional media does not take into account minority perspectives, or they don't have enough eyes on the ground, especially during COVID 19. But what I'm highlighting here is that it's a double edged sword. That by having this kind of free flow of information, there are also the lack of standards. There's the lack of editorial restraints. So I argue here, and this is a training, so I didn't build like a full case. I call this a blitz prep, where I basically give myself just a few minutes, maybe 10, very, very few minutes to try to write down as many thoughts as I can. Basically, I highlight the spread of fake information. I also emphasize here that as a byproduct, traditional news sources have received less and less support. And that with the rise of citizen journalism, my unique take there is it also directly led to the decrease of traditional journalism. I even have a preemption here where, yes, we acknowledge that traditional media can still thrive on social media, but they often compete and have to coexist with citizen journalism or exist behind a paywall just to keep up. So I'm already emphasizing that they can try to have the same benefit that we have, which is traditional news media, journalistic integrity, journalistic standards. But there's a trade off if they are to support citizen journalism, because if they are emphasizing all the perks of having a free flow of information, then they have to concede that traditional media as a result will become less popular. So, knowing what your priorities are and knowing what they're trying to have on their side, you can try to co opt it, which is the soft line thing you can do. And I don't recommend it all the time because eventually you'll have to draw the line somewhere. You cannot constantly argue, we can have both, we can have both. In the rise of citizen journalism, I think a lot of opposition teams fall victim to trying to run that they can have citizen journalism, but at the same time still have reliable news sites that can verify and cross check the takes of the people on the ground. But I don't think that's feasible. And it will work to a certain extent. You could win a debate that way. But I think the stronger thing to do is just admit it won't work. Ooh, I'm coughing now. When you are done identifying what your priorities are, what you want to focus on, and how you are going to get a leg up over the other team, and in BP specifically, this is very important because you need to have an edge, not just against your like direct opposing bench, but also someone within your own bench. So the sooner you can niche out your case, the better. The next thing you have to figure out is how much you will argue. And I think when I started out, I was struggling with this. And eventually I struggled on both ends because at first I feel like I wasn't arguing enough. I was always told that I wasn't running the arguments to their ultimate conclusion. And I agree. I was kind of scared, or I just didn't know how to build arguments as well as I do now. But now I face a different problem, which is I get so fixated on the small details that I run out of time. So you need to figure out how much of your time you are willing to use up for your argument, and then divvy up the information into that allotted period of time. So for instance, if I am a leader of opposition and I know I have to do some responses and a reframe, I will probably dedicate 1 minute to a reframe, 2 minutes to responses, and then 4 minutes to run a unique extension. Of course, this is going to be different based on the needs of the round. If you have a strong opponent, then I don't think it's harmful if you decide to extend your responses a little bit, so long as you are able to introduce something new in the process. So it's very important that you identify the basically the end product of your argument. To what extent do you want to prove something? So I usually start at the very end. I start with, okay, where do I end my argument? What do I want to prove ultimately? So that everything else that I do, I know where I'm running to. Otherwise, I'm just going to keep building and I don't know where I'm going to stop. And this is important because a lot of people, especially when they're younger, I have a lot of younger students and they love ending all their arguments with, everyone will die. And it's very adorable, but also very extreme. And I understand that if you go through the argument, basically, every argument can end in death if you wanted it to. If you don't study well, or if the education system is bad, then you grow up, you don't get a job, you don't earn money, you will starve, and then you die. And like, you'll be surprised how people tend to default to death. And I think there's even a debate there, I'm sure, about whether death is even such a bad thing, but I'm not going to touch that. The point is, figure out what harm or benefit it is that you want to argue towards, and that will kind of guide the rest of what you're building, because you will now know how much of an explanation you need to flesh out. You will also know what you can reasonably anticipate in the case of your opponent. So, another thing that really helped me when I was debating was I was arguing and building my argument as if someone was already having that debate with me. Ideally, you would have someone in your team that does that. That's the devil's advocate that is meant to push your case forward and basically speed run a lot of the argumentation that might come out from your opposing team. But I caution you not to do that too much as well. Because if your entire case is just made in anticipation of what your opponent might say, then you're not building anything. You're just doing preventive arguing, I guess, or you're doing very defensive debating, which I don't think is strategic. And I think I have made an episode before about the difference of defensive responses and aggressive responses. But I don't know. I don't know anymore what episode that was. That was years ago. Anyway, after you know how much to argue, you also need to know when your burden of proof is hit. So, how do you know that you are arguing what your side is meant to argue? And here, I would recommend don't bite off more than you can chew, obviously. You don't want to promise being able to solve the debate. You don't need to promise that all criminality will vanish. For the second motion, for example, in this list, I don't need to argue that the absence of citizen journalism will lead to the absence of fake news. I just have to argue that things would not be as bad as it is today because of all the like keyboard warriors and people who just do reporting even if it's wrong. So you want to innovate the debate, but you don't need to expect that you are creating it. You don't need to create an entirely new debate from scratch. You can still argue the basics. You can still argue the principles that are very important. You just need to make sure that you are adding to that discussion as opposed to just regurgitating all these different things. And more importantly, you also need to recognize the parameters being asked for. So do not debate farther than what the debate is asking you for. You always have to debate within. And recently, I was judging for a competition, and there was a team that lost, and they could not understand why they lost. And, that happens often. But I trust in my judgment. And the motion there was, I forgot at this point, but basically it was about patents. It was about removing patents for eco technology. And the team at Closing Government talked about how people are likely to opt in to giving up their patents because governments are likely to collaborate with companies. They are likely to help companies out. And the opposing team simply points out that they can have those too, and that it has nothing to do with the removal of patents, because government collaboration can happen with patents or without patents. And then they co opted it and said, government collaboration would happen better if we did have patents. And at that point, I was like, okay, I can't make them win. Reasonably, a lot of the other teams have pointed out the flaw of the case. But the case is not wrong. It's a good argument. It makes sense. It's logical in its construction. But at the same time, it's not within the parameters of the debate. Their burden was to prove the removal of patents. If they prove that governments are likely to collaborate and things will work out, that's a good bonus, but that was not what the debate was asking for. And for us to have gotten to that point in the debate, I had to accept what their opening was running, which was the removal of patents. So notice that elevating the debate is good, but if you bite too much or you fly too close to the sun, then you have the risk of just leaving orbit completely. So I would advise against that. So that's part two of strategizing your approach. If you are watching this video, by the way, and you notice that there's quite a lot of statics going on with my camera, I don't know why that happens. That tends to happen every time I hit record. And we're just gonna live with it. And we're just gonna pretend it doesn't happen, okay? Okay. All right. Part three. This is the part I was really excited about because this is about phrasing your case. This is where a lot of my fun starts. I think a lot of debating is just really words. It's all words. It's about how you string words together. It's about finding new ways to discuss ideas that have been discussed a bajillion times before. And I think this is the skill a lot of people tend to forget. When we debate, we have a tendency to aim to win. And that's good. I love winning. You love winning. Winning is a big reason we do this sport to begin with. But I think the creativity comes in being one of the few people or the first person, if you're lucky, to figure out a new way to combine different ideas together. So, to do that, for example, you want to figure out who the target audience or target market is first. Remember, this is still a public speaking sport. So you need to be able to persuade the judge. You need to be able to trick your own opponents and the people in your debate to side with you. And you also want the observers rooting for you. And to do that, you need to figure out the correct balance of how to package your idea. If it becomes too technical, then admittedly, you're not going to win to the new judges. And I know there's this trend now where we just like hate on judges because they should know better. And I agree sometimes. I think that we should put our judges to a higher standard. But you cannot always blame people for not comprehending you. And I think the best debaters are able to win regardless of the skill level of the judge because they make sure that everything that they say will hit no matter who is in the audience, no matter who is in the panel. Once you've achieved that level of persuasion, that you can fine tune your way of presenting your case such that the smartest judge or the most veteran debater will give you the win and the most newbie debater or newbie judge will feel inclined to give you the win and they understand why you are winning the debate, then I think that's when you ultimately win the whole thing. So, part of that is also knowing what your audience is able to understand about debate. And I've written about this in the past. I wonder if I can search that up. Nah, I don't want you to hear my keyboard. But I've written in my blog post before about the rise of jargon. So I have a blog called Average Reasonable Person. Maybe I will look that up. Average Reasonable Person. There we go. If you look that up, I did have like this whole thing about how the jargon of things has made it less likely for us to see eye to eye. Like debates have gotten worse. So it's called saying nothing when saying everything, and it's basically about how when I was new to debate and all these terminologies were thrown in my face, I didn't have a fun time. And I think because debate has elevated as a sport and we have all these like we have a bigger community now, partially because we can like yap like this online and there are people who write about debate, there are so many Facebook posts, we have so many Discord servers now dedicated to debate. It's only natural that we form our own lexicon, right? As a side note, wait, let's see if I can pull out my ebook from under all these wires. I've been reading this book called I'll Go Speak, and it talks about how social media transforms the future of language. So I think it's the premise is pretty straightforward. Because we are chronically online, the evolution of language has sped up. We have terms like Riz, and then we have Gyat, and then now we have 6-7, and I don't even know the origin of 6-7. There was a time where we were using the chair as a laughing emoji. Now, I don't know. I'm very old, but People send me skulls when they are laughing because that's the new haha, I guess. The point is, because debate operates in that same kind of space, we tend to accelerate the evolution of our arguments as well. And we're not realizing how a lot of people get left behind in that process. So you cannot just run Overton window and not explain it. Even the idea of social contract, which is like the most basic argument when you are starting out, you have to recognize not everyone will understand it the same way. So it's important here that if you know your audience and target market, you need to adjust. And this is very important for those who compete internationally. You will realize that the terms that you are using in Philippine debate and your style of debating in the Philippines, once you go abroad, there's like a big chance it's not going to translate the way you want it to. There's going to be a big chance it's not hitting the same, or that you are not getting credited in the way that you are used to. And a lot of the kids and the debaters that I coach and train, they go through this kind of experience. And I have to remind them, right, that everyone's culture is different. Even if you are all debating online, there's also a different game offline. I'm really bad at online debating. I've won a few online debates, sure, but I feel my star power personally shines best when I am able to stand behind a podium and when I'm able to project on a stage. And I think, yes, aura is part of it, I'm sure, and power dressing, and I love all those. But a lot of it is also the language that you choose. I would like to think that my or this podcast, is able to succeed because I am able to balance being able to give information to veteran debaters and still make it entertaining, while at the same time being able to info dump enough for newbies to pick up something that they can immediately use in tournaments. And of course, I have my skill sets are cultivated because of my coaching career, but I think my debating is also like a big facet there. And my style of debating, of finding the middle ground of terminologies and trying to find a way to present ideas that are still comprehensible, that can still be easily understood, but still feel elevated to a certain extent. So this is where you have to linguistically position yourself, because you also need to keep in mind you don't want to be too aggressive. You do not want to be dismissive, especially in a debate where everything relies on weighing and engagement. Yes, you have to push that you are correct in the debate, but after a certain point, if you are not budging at all or recognizing the merit of your opponent's argument, then you're just kind of debating like you're crossing each other, or you're just passing each other in the conversation, and you're not really adding or building on the debate that you should be building on. So you need to know, you need to make concessions, but at the same time, you need to be firm with your stances. And I wish there was a way for me to teach this skill. This is really just something that you learn along the way. There's something that I teach a lot of the people that like get trained under me, which is the idea of boiling the frog. You want to ease people into agreeing with you. And I find that starting with something controversial, or starting with the firmest stake, let's say the hardest proposition case that you can, is a good hook. And we encourage hooks, it grabs people's attentions. But if you stay in that opposition energy the whole time, or if you stay in that energy of just negating someone the whole time, people are gonna clock out. They're gonna zone out. They will feel that you are simply leading with aggression and you're not willing to engage. And I'm applying this to debate, but a lot of this is actually my frustrations with the political space and how we engage with politics. But that's like, I'll probably give a lecture on that some other time. But the point is, how do you transform language in a way that is firm with its stance? It has its clear boundaries. It's very clear what you are defending, but in a way that makes it quite inviting even to your opponent. So I guess this brings us to the last example that I have here, which is nationalizing energy companies to combat climate change. It's kind of weird because I do all this big talk about like, ooh, semantics and the performance of language and I pick a very boring motion. But I think that this will actually show the point the best, because in this case, I was leader of opposition, and I needed to argue that the nationalization of energy companies would actually lead to more harm, or that wasn't like the extreme thing I needed to defend. I had to at least defend that it was not a good idea. I think eventually I did argue that it would be dangerous, but oh no, I argued. What did I argue? Let me read through my case. Damn. Yeah. So I didn't want to nationalize energy companies. I argued that the diversity is actually good. I also argue later on in the stance that nationalization will cause more harm than good. And notice how I do the introduction, right? It's a very boring topic, and you want to start with a take that grabs people's attention. So I said, when we put control in the hands of the government, not only do we limit diversity, but we actively bring higher risk with less rewards. Putting all your eggs in one basket is likely to fail when the basket is badly made. So here I'm already kind of hinting a lot of the arguments I will be saying later on. I talk about the lack of diversity. I also talk about how it's risky to suddenly limit your portfolio. And then I take a jab at the government, and I talk about how the most governments are not equipped to handle climate change, and they're not equipped to deal with energy companies. So semantically and rhetorically, you can already see what my strategy for this speech was. And you can read through all of it and pause somewhere. But again, this was a blitz prep. So I didn't I ran all of this without really, like building the full thing, which I think you should get used to anyway. You have 15 minutes of preparation. This is actually quite a lot of notes. And that's because I was typing. But yeah, I talk about how, like, I'm not opposing the idea, and I do see the merit of the idea of nationalizing energy companies. Like, we recognize that a lot of competition can be harmful. We recognize that there needs to be an alignment of the plan. But do we need to nationalize to get all that done? Do we need to limit the diversity and basically ban all these other companies from existing? So I said here in context that many industries are already making steps in their own capacity to combat climate change, as mandated by law, which points out that the government can still be involved through social corporate responsibility, highlighting that there is a personal incentive for them to do this anyway, and as well as through their own capacities and want to phase out a slowly dying industry. So notice, even in how I build my frame and context, I'm already hinting at a lot of arguments. And I think that's the efficiency that you want to hit when you are building a case. And I'm not a fan of lecturing with my own samples, because it feels quite like self-congratulatory. But I have so much material. I've been debating for years. I just ought to just reuse some of them to prove my point. But yeah, if you are framing a debate and you are figuring out an angle to approach it, the more you can condense ideas, the better. I actually forgot to put letter C here when you are phrasing the case, but you really need to master word economy. I'm obviously less strict about that right now because I'm podcasting and this is basically my yapathon. But when you are debating, every word counts, every second counts. You want to get rid of your fillers. You want to make sure that when you are speaking, you are getting the idea across with as little analysis as possible so that you can cram more analysis in. And I know I said I'm not a fan of the whole stringing logical components together like a math equation, but math can also be beautiful. Words are also math in a way. So you cannot escape that we will need to cram as many concepts as we can, but it doesn't need to be bland. It can still be rather elevated. It can still be punchy. It can hide a lot of nuanced layers. You can actually build a lot of introductions and frames that kind of have ideas and arguments that are already like crouching and waiting to expose themselves. A lot of my frames, for instance, when I do for speaker, I try as much as possible to already hint at the extensions my teammates will provide without being upfront about it, if that makes sense. I give a lot of the small details that my partners can build on later, because the goal is you're setting the groundwork. You're setting the stage so that all the other flourishes can come in later. So yeah, that's all I want to say about persuasion and framing. If you are watching this and you are cramming, I hope this helps for those who are competing in a weekend, or if you are competing and you are listening to just to this to cram, best of luck to you. So that's it for this episode of Debatable. I will see you in the next one. Bye bye.